The morning sun cast long shadows through the pristine glass facade of Metropolitan General Hospital, one of the most prestigious medical facilities in the city. Its marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, while designer furniture adorned waiting areas that resembled luxury hotel lobbies more than traditional hospital spaces. This was not merely a place of healing, it was a monument to exclusivity, where wealth determined not just the quality of care, but the very dignity with which one was treated. The hospital's architecture itself told a story of division. The main entrance, with its soaring ceilings and mahogany-paneled walls, led directly to the VIP wing, a sanctuary reserved for those whose bank accounts matched their medical needs. Here, private suites rivaled five-star accommodations, complete with marble bathrooms, imported linens, and personal chefs. The regular patient floors, accessible through a separate, more modest entrance, bore the sterile functionality expected of standard medical care. It was a system designed to remind everyone, at every moment, exactly where they belonged in society's hierarchy. Victoria Hamilton had spent the better part of her adult life navigating such hierarchies, though few would recognize her name or face in the corridors of power she now inhabited. At 42, she possessed the kind of understated elegance that came from years of careful observation and strategic silence. Her tailored navy suit, expertly cut to complement her athletic frame, spoke of success without ostentation. The single strand of pearls at her throat and the vintage Rolex on her wrist were quality pieces, but not the flashy displays favored by nouveau-rich social climbers. What the world didn't know, what even the hospital's own board of directors had yet to fully grasp, was that Victoria had just completed the largest healthcare acquisition in the state's history. 3 weeks prior, her investment consortium had purchased the entire Metropolitan Healthcare Group, including this very hospital, for $2.7 billion. The paperwork was finalized, the regulatory approvals secured, and the transition plan meticulously drafted. Tomorrow's board meeting would officially announce her as the new chairman and chief executive officer. Today, however, she was simply a woman whose beloved aunt lay critically ill in the hospital's most expensive VIP suite. Eleanor Hamilton, the woman who had raised Victoria after her parents' death in a car accident when she was 8, had suffered a massive stroke 3 days earlier. At 76, Eleanor's prognosis was uncertain, but her condition had stabilized enough that she was conscious and alert. Victoria had flown in from Boston immediately upon receiving the call, though work commitments had prevented her from visiting until now. As Victoria approached the hospital's main entrance, she reflected on the irony of the situation. She had purchased this institution not out of business calculation alone, but because her research had revealed disturbing patterns of discriminatory treatment based on race and economic status. Patient satisfaction surveys told a story of two-tiered care that went far beyond the obvious division between VIP and standard rooms. Complaints of dismissive treatment, delayed responses, and outright hostility toward patients of color had been buried in administrative files, far from public scrutiny. The automatic doors whispered open, ushering Victoria into the hospital's opulent lobby. Her heels clicked softly against the polished marble as she made her way toward the VIP wing elevators. The directory indicated that her aunt's suite was on the 7th floor, the hospital's premier level, where rooms cost $1,500 per night, beyond what insurance would cover. Victoria had paid that premium without hesitation, not because she sought luxury, but because she wanted Eleanor to receive the absolute best care available. She had specifically requested the hospital's top cardiac specialist and a private nursing team. Money, she had learned long ago, was often the only language institutions like this understood. At the elevator bank serving the VIP floors, a security checkpoint had been established, an unusual feature she didn't remember from the hospital's website. A uniformed guard sat behind a marble desk, flanked by 2 nurses who appeared to be screening visitors. The setup felt more like an exclusive club than a medical facility. Victoria approached the desk with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being where she belonged. "Good morning," she said pleasantly, reaching into her purse for identification. "I'm here to visit Eleanor Hamilton in Suite 712. The security guard, a heavyset man in his 50s named Robert Chen, according to his badge, looked up from his newspaper with obvious irritation. His eyes performed a quick assessment of Victoria, taking in her race, her attire, her bearing before his expression settled into something between skepticism and disdain. "Visiting hours for VIP patients are by appointment only," he said, not bothering to check any computer system or visitor log. "You'll need to go through the family liaison office, downstairs, and provide proper authorization." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Eleanor Hamilton's niece, and I've been in contact with Dr. Richardson about her condition. There should be a notation in her file that I have full visitation privileges." One of the nurses, a sharp-featured woman whose name tag read Sharon Mitchell, RN, leaned forward with a thin smile. "Ma'am, Mrs. Hamilton is in our most exclusive suite. Her family has been very specific about maintaining privacy and limiting access to approved individuals only." The implication hung in the air like a noxious gas. Victoria felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she had experienced countless times throughout her life when confronted with the assumption that she didn't belong, couldn't afford, or had somehow found herself in the wrong place. "I understand the need for privacy," Victoria replied evenly. "Perhaps you could call the nursing station for Suite 712 and verify that Eleanor Hamilton has requested to see her niece, Victoria Hamilton. I can provide identification and any other documentation you require." Robert the security guard exchanged a meaningful glance with Nurse Mitchell before turning back to Victoria with undisguised condescension. "Look, I'm sure you understand that we get all kinds of people claiming to be relatives of our VIP patients. We have to be very careful about who we allow access to these floors." The phrase "all kinds of people" was delivered with enough emphasis to make his meaning crystal clear. Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained controlled. "Of course, security is important. That's why I'm happy to show you my identification and follow whatever verification process you have in place." "The process," interrupted the second nurse, whose badge identified her as Linda Foster, RN, "is that all VIP visitors must be pre-approved through our family liaison office. You can't just show up here expecting to be let upstairs." Victoria noticed that several other visitors, all of whom appeared to be white, had passed through the checkpoint during their conversation without being subjected to the same scrutiny. An elderly white man in an expensive suit had simply nodded to the guards and been waved through to the elevators. A middle-aged white woman carrying flowers had been greeted warmly and escorted personally to her destination. "I see," Victoria said quietly. "And where exactly is this family liaison office?" "Ground floor, past the cafeteria, through the administrative wing," Robert replied with obvious satisfaction. "They close at 4:30, so you'll want to hurry." Victoria glanced at her watch. It was 4:15 in the afternoon. She stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of decades of similar encounters pressing down on her shoulders. The subtle but unmistakable message was clear: you don't belong here, and we will make sure you understand that fact. The systematic humiliation was almost artful in its cruelty, bureaucratic obstacles designed to exhaust and demoralize, forcing her to prove her worthiness to visit her own dying aunt. What struck her most profoundly was not just the racism itself, but the casual confidence with which it was being deployed. These people genuinely believed they held all the power in this situation, that she was just another person they could dismiss and diminish with impunity. They had no idea that they were speaking to the woman who now owned not just their jobs, but their entire professional futures. Victoria's mind drifted back to a summer afternoon 34 years earlier, when she was 8 years old and staying with Aunt Eleanor while her parents were away on their anniversary trip. They had gone to the community pool in Eleanor's middle-class neighborhood, and Victoria had been excited to try out the diving board for the first time. The pool manager, a sunburned man with a beer belly and tobacco-stained teeth, had stopped them at the gate. "I'm sorry, but we're at capacity for non-members today," he had said, though the pool was clearly less than half full. "You might want to try the public pool over on Elm Street." 8-year-old Victoria hadn't understood why Eleanor's face had gone so still and hard, why her aunt had gripped her hand so tightly as they walked back to the car in silence. It wasn't until years later that Victoria realized what had really happened that day, how the presence of a black child had somehow threatened the comfort of the white families lounging by the crystal blue water. Eleanor had driven them to the public pool on Elm Street, which was overcrowded, poorly maintained, and staffed by teenagers who seemed more interested in their phones than pool safety. But Victoria had learned to dive that day anyway, because Eleanor had refused to let someone else's prejudice steal her niece's joy. Now, standing in this marble-clad hospital lobby, Victoria felt that same mixture of rage and determination that had sustained her through law school, through her early years on Wall Street, through every boardroom where she had been the only black face among dozens of white men in expensive suits. The difference was that 8-year-old Victoria had been powerless to fight back. The 42-year-old version was not. "Thank you for the information," she said to the guards, her voice carrying a new edge that none of them seemed to recognize as dangerous. "I'll be sure to follow the proper procedures." As Victoria turned away from the checkpoint, she could hear the low murmur of conversation behind her. Nurse Mitchell's voice carried just enough for her to catch the words "typical" and "probably doesn't even know the patient." Robert's gravelly laugh followed, and she heard him say something about people thinking they can just walk into places like they own them. The irony of that particular comment almost made Victoria smile. She made her way to the elevator bank, serving the administrative offices, her mind already shifting into the strategic mode that had served her so well in business. These people had made a critical error in judgment. They had assumed that humiliating her would be consequence-free, that she would simply accept their treatment and slink away defeated. They were about to learn otherwise. The administrative wing of the hospital buzzed with the usual late-afternoon energy of a large institution winding down for the day. Victoria located the family liaison office and found, as expected, that it had closed 15 minutes earlier. The timing was clearly not coincidental. The guards upstairs had known exactly what they were doing when they sent her on this futile errand. Standing in the empty hallway, Victoria pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for James Morrison, the hospital's current chief executive officer. Morrison was unaware that his position was about to become obsolete, but he would serve her purposes for the next few minutes. The call went to voicemail, as she had expected. Senior executives at institutions like this rarely answered unknown numbers after business hours. Victoria left a brief message identifying herself as a representative of Hamilton Equity Partners, her investment firm, with an urgent matter regarding the hospital's operations that required immediate attention. Within 3 minutes, her phone rang. "Miss Hamilton? This is James Morrison returning your call. I understand you have some concerns about our operations?" Victoria's voice was crisp and professional. "Good evening, Mr. Morrison. I appreciate you calling back so quickly. I'm currently in your hospital visiting a patient, and I've encountered some concerning issues with your VIP access procedures that I believe require immediate executive attention." Of course. What kind of issues are we talking about?" "The kind that could expose this institution to significant legal liability," Victoria replied smoothly. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person rather than over the phone. Could you meet me in your office in, say, 15 minutes? There was a pause as Morrison clearly weighed the implications of her words. Legal liability was a phrase that got hospital administrators' attention faster than any other combination of words in the English language. "Certainly. I'll be right down. Are you in the main lobby? I'll meet you there." Victoria made her way back through the hospital corridors, noting details she had missed on her first pass through the building. The staff break room was visible through an open doorway, and she could see several employees gathered around a television, laughing at something on the screen. Their casual attitude suggested a workplace culture that had grown comfortable with certain standards or lack thereof. She positioned herself near the main elevators, where Morrison would be most likely to find her, and waited. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant in Boston. "Board meeting materials finalized. Announcement draft ready for review. Legal has signed off on all transition documents." Tomorrow's meeting would officially mark her emergence from the shadows of financial markets into the public eye of healthcare leadership. But tonight's events had accelerated her timeline considerably. The elevator chimed, and a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit stepped out, scanning the lobby with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. Victoria recognized him from the professional photos in the hospital's annual reports. James Morrison, age 59, Harvard Business School graduate, 23 years in healthcare administration. She approached him with her hand extended. "Mr. Morrison?" "Victoria Hamilton. Thank you for making time on such short notice." Morrison's handshake was firm, and his smile professionally warm, though she could see the calculation behind his eyes as he assessed her. Clearly, her appearance didn't match whatever he had expected from a representative of a major investment firm. "Not at all, Miss Hamilton. Why don't we go up to my office where we can speak privately?" They rode the elevator in silence, and Victoria used the time to study Morrison's demeanor. He was nervous but trying to hide it, which suggested that he had some awareness of potential problems within his organization. That might work in her favor. Morrison's office occupied a corner of the executive floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. The decor was predictably masculine: dark wood, leather chairs, medical diplomas, and photographs with various politicians and civic leaders. "Please, have a seat." Morrison gestured toward one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Can I offer you anything to drink? Coffee? Water?" "No, thank you." Victoria settled into the chair and placed her purse beside her. "I'll get straight to the point, Mr. Morrison. This afternoon, I witnessed and experienced what can only be described as systematic discriminatory treatment in your VIP access area." Morrison's expression shifted to one of serious concern, though Victoria detected a hint of skepticism beneath the surface. "That's certainly troubling to hear. Can you tell me specifically what happened?" Victoria recounted the events at the security checkpoint in precise detail, noting the different treatment given to white visitors versus her own experience. She described the guards' attitudes, the nurses' comments, and the deliberately obstructive referral to a closed office. "Furthermore," she continued, "I have reason to believe this is not an isolated incident, but rather part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that could expose this hospital to substantial legal and financial liability. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he processed her account. Miss Hamilton, I want to assure you that discrimination of any kind goes against our core values and institutional policies. However, our VIP security procedures are designed to protect patient privacy and safety. Sometimes that can create inconveniences, but it's not intended to single out any particular individuals. It was a masterful deflection, acknowledging her concerns while simultaneously dismissing them as misunderstandings rather than genuine problems. Victoria recognized the technique from countless corporate meetings where inconvenient truths were politely buried beneath layers of institutional doublespeak. I appreciate your position, Victoria replied evenly. However, I'm not talking about inconvenience. I'm talking about federal civil rights violations that could result in Department of Justice investigations, Medicare funding cuts, and class action lawsuits that could cost this institution hundreds of millions of dollars. Morrison's expression sharpened. That seems like a rather extreme characterization of what sounds like a procedural miscommunication. Victoria opened her purse and withdrew a leather portfolio. From it, she extracted several documents, which she placed on Morrison's desk with deliberate precision. These, she said quietly, are the final ownership transfer documents for Metropolitan Healthcare Group, signed 3 days ago and filed with the State Regulatory Commission this morning. Effective immediately, Hamilton Equity Partners now owns 100% of this hospital and its related facilities. Morrison's face went completely white as he stared at the documents. Victoria continued speaking in the same calm, measured tone. And this, she said, placing a second set of papers on the desk, is my appointment as Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, effective upon completion of the acquisition. The silence in the room was so complete that Victoria could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the documents and scanned them with the desperate hope that they might be forgeries or elaborate jokes. They were not. I purchased this hospital, Victoria continued, specifically because of its reputation for discriminatory practices. What I experienced downstairs this afternoon was not a miscommunication or a procedural oversight. It was a perfect illustration of the institutional racism that has made this place a liability rather than an asset to the healthcare community. Morrison's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Miss Hamilton, I had no idea. The board never informed me about any ownership changes. The board will be informed tomorrow morning, Victoria replied. But tonight, I'm informing you. And I'm also informing you that your services as CEO will no longer be required as of tomorrow at 5 p.m. Morrison's shock was giving way to panic as the implications became clear. Please, Miss Hamilton, surely we can discuss this. If there have been problems with our staff, we can address them immediately. Training programs, policy revisions, whatever you think is necessary. Victoria stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city lights, beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. When she turned back to face Morrison, her expression was implacable. Mr. Morrison, 3 hours ago I was denied the basic dignity of visiting my dying aunt because your staff judged me unworthy based on the color of my skin. They were so confident in their prejudices, so secure in their power over me, that they didn't even bother to hide their contempt. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. That confidence came from somewhere. It came from an institutional culture that you fostered and tolerated. It came from the certainty that there would be no consequences for their behavior, no accountability for their actions. Morrison started to speak, but Victoria held up a hand to stop him. You want to discuss training programs and policy revisions? Here's my policy revision. Every single employee who participated in today's discrimination will be terminated immediately. No severance, no references, no second chances. Miss Hamilton, please, we're talking about people's livelihoods, their families. Did they consider my aunt's family when they denied me the right to see her? Victoria's voice carried a steel edge now. Did they think about the consequences for the families of other patients they've treated with similar contempt over the years? She returned to the desk and gathered up her documents. I want you to call an emergency meeting of all department heads for 8 p.m. tonight. I want the complete personnel files of every employee who was working the VIP checkpoint this afternoon. And I want the security footage from the main lobby for the past 6 hours. Morrison nodded frantically, clearly grasping for any opportunity to salvage his position. Of course, absolutely. I'll have everything ready within the hour. Good, Victoria said, heading toward the door. Oh, and Mr. Morrison? I'll be visiting my aunt now. I trust there won't be any further obstacles to my access. As the door closed behind her, Victoria could hear Morrison frantically dialing his phone, presumably to warn his staff about the hurricane that was about to hit them. But it was too late for warnings now. The elevator ride down to the VIP floor gave Victoria a moment to center herself. Her anger was ice-cold and completely controlled now, focused into the kind of surgical precision that had made her fortune in the business world. This was not about revenge, it was about accountability. About consequences. About ensuring that no other family would face the humiliation she had endured today. The VIP security checkpoint looked exactly as she had left it an hour earlier. Robert the security guard was still reading his newspaper, though he now had a cup of coffee beside him. Nurses, Mitchell and Foster, were engaged in animated conversation about weekend plans. Their voices carrying the casual comfort of people who believed themselves untouchable. Victoria approached the desk for the second time that day, but this time her bearing was different. Gone was any trace of the accommodating visitor seeking permission. She walked with the authority of ownership, the confidence of absolute power. "Good evening," she said quietly. Robert looked up with the same expression of irritated disdain he had shown earlier. "You again? I thought I told you the family liaison office was closed." "You did," Victoria replied. "But I won't be needing their services after all." She placed a single document on the desk, a letter of authorization signed by James Morrison and stamped with the hospital's official seal, granting Victoria Hamilton unlimited access to all areas of the facility in her capacity as incoming chief executive officer. Robert's eyes widened as he read the letter, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. Nurse Mitchell leaned over to read it as well, her sharp features going slack with shock. "There must be some mistake," Mitchell stammered. "This can't be right." "There's no mistake," Victoria said calmly. "I am Victoria Hamilton, chairman and CEO of Hamilton Equity Partners, which as of this morning owns 100% of this hospital. I am also the niece of Eleanor Hamilton, the patient in Suite 712 whom I was attempting to visit when you decided to demonstrate your commitment to discriminatory treatment of patients' families." The security checkpoint had gone completely silent. Linda Foster, who had been standing nearby reviewing patient charts, had frozen in place with her mouth slightly open. Robert's coffee cup trembled in his hand as the full magnitude of the situation became clear. "Now," Victoria continued, "I have 2 questions for you. First, do any of you have any legitimate medical or safety concerns about my visiting Suite 712 at this time?" The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Robert managed to croak. "No, ma'am." "Excellent. Second question. Can any of you provide a satisfactory explanation for why your treatment of me this afternoon differed so dramatically from your treatment of other visitors?" This time the silence was even longer. Mitchell's face had gone from pale to red to pale again, and Foster appeared to be fighting back tears. Robert seemed to have stopped breathing altogether. "I see," Victoria said finally. "In that case, I have some information to share with you. Mr. Morrison is currently preparing termination paperwork for everyone who participated in today's discriminatory actions. Your employment with this institution will end at midnight tonight." The words hit the group like a physical blow. Foster's chart clipboard clattered to the marble floor, and Mitchell sank into the nearest chair as if her legs could no longer support her. "Please," Robert whispered, I have a family. I've worked here for 15 years. Victoria's expression didn't soften. "And in those 15 years, how many other families do you think you've treated with the same contempt you showed me today? How many other people have you judged unworthy of basic human dignity based solely on their appearance?" "It wasn't like that," Mitchell protested weakly. "We were just following security protocols. The same protocols that allowed 3 white visitors to pass through this checkpoint without question while I was standing here." Victoria's voice remained deadly calm. "The protocols that sent me to a closed office on a deliberate wild goose chase." "Those protocols?" Foster was openly crying now, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "We can change," she managed to say. "Please give us another chance." Victoria studied each of their faces with the detached interest of a scientist examining specimens. 3 hours ago, you held all the power in this situation. You were confident, dismissive, even cruel in your certainty that you could treat me however you pleased. Where was your concern for second chances then? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. You didn't offer me the chance to prove my relationship to my aunt. You didn't offer me the courtesy of basic human respect. You didn't offer me anything except humiliation and obstacles, because you believed I was powerless to fight back. Victoria picked up her purse and turned toward the elevators. The security footage from this afternoon will be reviewed by our legal department to identify any additional staff members who may have participated in discriminatory behavior. I suggest you use whatever time you have left to clean out your personal belongings. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Victoria could hear the sound of Mitchell's chair scraping across the marble floor, and Foster's quiet weeping. The sounds should have brought her satisfaction, but instead she felt only a profound weariness. This was not how she had wanted to spend the evening when her aunt lay critically ill just floors above. The 7th floor of the VIP wing was a study in understated luxury. Thick carpeting muffled all sound, and the lighting was warm and residential rather than the harsh fluorescent glare of standard hospital floors. Original artwork lined the walls, and comfortable seating areas were positioned near large windows overlooking the city. Suite 712 was located at the end of the hallway, its double doors marked only with discreet brass numbers. Victoria knocked gently and waited for permission to enter. "Come in," came a familiar voice, strong despite its fragile circumstances. Eleanor Hamilton lay propped up in a hospital bed that looked more like luxury bedroom furniture than medical equipment. At 76, she retained the elegant bearing that had made her a formidable presence in the local arts community for decades. Her silver hair was perfectly styled despite her condition, and her dark eyes sparked with the intelligence and humor that Victoria remembered from childhood. "There you are, sweetheart," Eleanor said, extending a hand that Victoria grasped gently. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd gotten lost in this maze of a building." Victoria settled into the bedside chair, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders for the first time all day. "Something like that. How are you feeling, Aunt Eleanor?" "Like I've been hit by a truck, but at least it was a luxury truck," Eleanor replied with a weak smile. "The doctor says I'm making good progress. My speech is clear, and most of the numbness on my left side has resolved. Could have been much worse." They talked quietly for nearly an hour, covering Eleanor's medical condition, her treatment plan, and her expectations for recovery. The conversation was a balm to Victoria's spirit after the afternoon's confrontations, reminding her of why she had fought so hard to be here. As visiting hours drew to a close, Eleanor squeezed Victoria's hand. "You seem upset about something beyond my condition. What's troubling you?" Victoria hesitated, unwilling to burden her aunt with additional stress. But Eleanor had always been able to read her like an open book, and there was no point in trying to hide her emotional state. "I had some difficulty getting up here to see you," Victoria said carefully. "The hospital staff seemed to think I didn't belong in the VIP section." Eleanor's eyes flashed with a familiar fire. "Ah. The usual nonsense. I'm sorry you had to deal with that, especially today." "It's handled," Victoria said quietly. "It won't happen again." Eleanor studied her niece's face with shrewd perception. "Victoria Hamilton, you've got that look you used to get when the neighborhood bullies would pick on the smaller kids. What exactly have you done?" Despite everything, Victoria found herself smiling. "Let's just say that some people are about to learn that actions have consequences." "Good," Eleanor said firmly. "I didn't raise you to let anyone treat you as less than you are. Your parents would be proud of the woman you've become." As Victoria prepared to leave, promising to return first thing in the morning, Eleanor called her back to the bedside. "Whatever you're planning," Eleanor said with a knowing look, "remember that the goal isn't just to punish the people who wronged you. It's to make sure they can't wrong anyone else." Walking back through the hospital corridors toward the main lobby, Victoria reflected on her aunt's words. Eleanor was right, as always. This wasn't about personal vengeance, it was about institutional change. About ensuring that the next person who walked through these doors would be treated with the dignity and respect that every human being deserved. The emergency meeting Morrison had called was already in session when Victoria arrived at the executive conference room. Through the glass walls, she could see department heads seated around a polished oak table, their faces reflecting various degrees of confusion and concern. Morrison stood at the head of the table, his earlier panic now replaced by the grim resignation of a man who understood that his career was effectively over. Victoria entered the room without knocking, her presence immediately commanding everyone's attention. The conversation died mid-sentence as 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her. "Good evening," she said, taking the empty chair at the opposite end of the table from Morrison. "I'm Victoria Hamilton, your new owner and CEO. I assume Mr. Morrison has briefed you on the ownership transition." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled around the table. Victoria recognized several faces from the hospital's website: Dr. Patricia Reeves, Chief Medical Officer; Michael Thompson, Head of Human Resources; Sarah Chen, Director of Nursing, and others whose names and titles would become familiar over the coming weeks. "What he may not have told you," Victoria continued, "is why I called this meeting tonight rather than waiting for tomorrow's scheduled announcement. This afternoon, I witnessed firsthand the kind of discriminatory treatment that has apparently become standard practice at this institution." She recounted the day's events with clinical precision, noting each violation of federal anti-discrimination law and hospital policy. Several department heads shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the implications became clear. The individuals directly involved in today's incident will be terminated effective immediately, Victoria announced. However, discrimination rarely occurs in a vacuum. It typically reflects broader cultural problems within an organization. Dr. Reeves cleared her throat. Miss Hamilton, while I certainly don't condone discriminatory behavior, I hope you'll consider that terminating experienced staff members over a single incident might be an overreaction. Victoria's gaze fixed on the doctor with laser intensity. Dr. Reeves, would you characterize the systematic humiliation of patients' families as a single incident? Would you describe the violation of federal civil rights laws as an overreaction to address? Of course not, Dr. Reeves backpedaled quickly. I simply meant that perhaps additional training and supervision might achieve the same goals without destroying people's careers. The time for training and supervision was before today's incident occurred, Victoria replied. The time for additional chances was during the 15 years that Robert Chen worked at that security checkpoint, or the 8 years that Sharon Mitchell has been treating patients and families with contempt. Michael Thompson, the HR director, spoke up nervously. Miss Hamilton, from a legal standpoint, terminating employees without progressive discipline could expose us to wrongful termination claims. Victoria turned her attention to Thompson with an expression that made him visibly wince. Mr. Thompson, are you familiar with the concept of employment at will? Yes, of course, but then you understand that employees can be terminated immediately for cause. Discriminatory treatment of patients and their families certainly qualifies as cause, particularly when it violates federal law. She paused to let this sink in before continuing. Furthermore, any employee who wishes to file a wrongful termination claim is welcome to do so. I'm confident that our legal team will be happy to present the security footage and witness testimony that documents their discriminatory behavior. The room had gone completely quiet. Victoria could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, as each department head considered their own potential liability and the staff members under their supervision. Which brings me to my next point, Victoria continued. Effective immediately, every department will conduct a comprehensive review of patient complaints and incident reports from the past 3 years. I want to identify any patterns of discriminatory treatment, whether based on race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, or economic status. Sarah Chen, the nursing director, raised her hand tentatively. What kind of timeline are we looking at for this review? 30 days, Victoria replied. Any employee identified as having engaged in discriminatory behavior will be terminated. Any supervisor who failed to address such behavior will be disciplined or terminated depending on the severity of their negligence. The implications were staggering. In an institution the size of Metropolitan General, with over 3,000 employees, a thorough review could potentially impact hundreds of jobs. Victoria could see the fear in their faces as they contemplated the magnitude of the changes she was proposing. I understand this seems extreme, Victoria said, her tone softening slightly. But I want to be crystal clear about our new direction. This hospital will become a model of inclusive, respectful healthcare. We will treat every patient and every family member with dignity, regardless of their background or ability to pay. Dr. Reeves leaned forward. Miss Hamilton, may I ask about your plans for the hospital's financial model? The VIP program generates significant revenue that helps subsidize care for uninsured patients. It was a fair question and one that Victoria had anticipated. The VIP program will continue, but with fundamental changes to ensure that premium pricing reflects enhanced amenities and services, not superior medical care. Every patient will receive the same quality of clinical treatment regardless of their room assignment. She stood and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room, picking up a marker. Let me outline our new core principles. On the board, she wrote, respect, excellence, equity, accountability. These 4 principles will guide every decision we make going forward. Respect means treating every person who enters this building with dignity and courtesy. Excellence means providing the highest quality medical care to every patient. Equity means ensuring that race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and economic status never influence the quality of treatment. Accountability means that violations of these principles will have immediate and serious consequences. Victoria turned back to face the room. I need each of you to decide tonight whether you can commit to these principles. Anyone who cannot should submit their resignation by tomorrow morning. There will be no shame in that decision, and I will provide positive references for anyone who chooses to seek opportunities elsewhere. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Morrison spoke up. Miss Hamilton, what about my position? I assume you'll want to bring in your own leadership team. Victoria nodded. "Mr. Morrison, your resignation will be effective tomorrow at 5 p.m. as we discussed. I'll be serving as interim CEO while we conduct a national search for a permanent replacement. The new CEO will be someone who shares our commitment to inclusive healthcare." One by one, the department heads indicated their willingness to work within the new framework. Some seemed genuinely committed to change. Others appeared motivated, primarily by the desire to keep their jobs. Victoria would sort out which was which over the coming weeks. As the meeting concluded, Victoria gathered her materials and prepared to leave. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word of the changes spread throughout the hospital, but tonight's work was done. "One final thing," she said as the department heads filed out. "I want the names and contact information for every employee who was terminated tonight. They will receive full severance packages and positive employment references for any non-supervisory positions they may seek elsewhere." Dr. Reeves paused in the doorway. "That's very generous, considering." "It's not generous," Victoria corrected. "It's recognition that individual prejudice often reflects institutional failure. We failed to train them properly, failed to establish clear standards, failed to create a culture where discrimination was unacceptable. They bear responsibility for their actions, but we bear responsibility for the environment that enabled those actions." Walking through the hospital corridors one final time that evening, Victoria observed the late shift staff going about their duties. Some looked up as she passed, curiosity evident in their faces. Word of the day's events was clearly beginning to spread through the building's informal communication networks. Tomorrow, everyone would know that the rules had changed. The question was whether they would embrace the new standards or resist them. Victoria was prepared for either response. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant. "Press release drafted for morning announcement. Board meeting confirmed for 9 a.m. Legal team standing by for any employment issues." Victoria typed back, "Good. Add a line about our commitment to becoming a model of inclusive healthcare. And schedule interviews with potential HR directors who have experience with diversity and inclusion programs." As she reached the main lobby, Victoria paused to look back at the VIP elevator bank where her ordeal had begun just hours earlier. The security checkpoint was now staffed by different personnel. Apparently Morrison had acted quickly to implement interim coverage. The new guards nodded respectfully as she passed, clearly having been briefed on her identity and authority. The irony was not lost on her. 12 hours ago, she had been denied access to this very elevator. Now, she owned the building it served. But the real victory was not in her change of fortune. It was in the changes that would prevent future families from experiencing the humiliation she had endured. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of transformation. Victoria's limousine waited at the curb, but she decided to walk for a few blocks to clear her head before returning to her hotel. The city streets were quiet at this hour, with only occasional pedestrians and the distant hum of traffic. Victoria found herself thinking about the employees she had terminated tonight. They had families, mortgages, responsibilities. Their actions had been inexcusable, but they were also human beings whose lives had been dramatically altered by a few moments of poor judgment. Yet that was precisely the point. Poor judgment had consequences, especially when it involved the systematic dehumanization of other people. The security guard, the nurses, and the other staff members had made choices that day. They had chosen to judge her by her race rather than her character. They had chosen to humiliate her rather than help her. They had chosen to abuse their small measure of power rather than use it responsibly. Those choices had consequences. Just as her choice to purchase the hospital had consequences. Just as her choice to demand accountability had consequences. The difference was that her consequences created opportunities for positive change, while theirs had created only pain and division. As Victoria reached her hotel, she reflected on Aunt Eleanor's words about ensuring that wrongdoers couldn't harm anyone else. That was exactly what today had been about: not revenge, but prevention. Not punishment for its own sake, but accountability in service of a larger good. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be media attention, legal reviews, staff meetings, and the 1,000 small decisions required to transform an institution's culture. Some employees would embrace the changes. Others would resist them. Some patients and families would celebrate the new direction. Others might question whether standards were being lowered in the name of political correctness. But Victoria was ready for all of it. She had spent her entire career navigating complex organizations and driving change in the face of resistance. More importantly, she had spent her entire life understanding what it meant to be judged by factors beyond her control, and she was uniquely positioned to ensure that no one else would face that judgment within these walls. The hotel lobby was nearly empty, with only the night desk clerk and a security guard on duty. As Victoria crossed the marble floor toward the elevators, she caught her reflection in the polished surface of a decorative column. She looked composed, professional, unruffled by the day's events. It was a good image for a CEO to project, but it didn't capture the full story. Beneath the calm exterior, Victoria carried the weight of every similar encounter she had experienced over the years. Every suspicious glance in an upscale store, every assumption that she was someone's assistant rather than the person in charge, every moment when her qualifications had been questioned in ways that her white colleagues never experienced. Those experiences had shaped her, hardened her, and ultimately empowered her to fight back when fighting back became possible. They had also given her the wisdom to understand that systemic change required more than individual success. It required the willingness to use power responsibly, to extend protection to others who lacked the resources to protect themselves. In her hotel suite, Victoria poured herself a glass of wine and settled into the armchair by the window. The hospital was visible in the distance, its lit windows a reminder of the work that lay ahead. Somewhere in that building, Eleanor was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the revolution that had taken place in the floors below her room. Victoria's phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. The caller ID showed her business partner and closest friend, Marcus Washington. "I heard you made quite an impression at your new acquisition today," Marcus said without preamble. "News travels fast," Victoria replied. "When someone fires an entire security shift and calls an emergency board meeting on the same day they take ownership, word tends to get around." "Want to tell me what happened?" Victoria recounted the day's events, knowing that Marcus would understand the deeper implications better than anyone else. They had been business partners for 12 years and friends for longer than that, navigating the predominantly white world of high finance together. "Damn," Marcus said when she finished. "Are you sure about the scorched earth approach? You could have made your point without the mass terminations." "Could I?" Victoria asked. "Marcus, these people didn't just make a mistake. They engaged in deliberate, systematic discrimination, because they were confident there would be no consequences. The only way to change that culture is to prove them wrong." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You're right, of course. It's just going to be a hell of a fight going forward. Every decision you make will be scrutinized through the lens of race. Every personnel change will be seen as either favoritism or reverse discrimination. Let them scrutinize," Victoria said firmly. "I didn't buy this hospital to make friends. I bought it to prove that healthcare can be both profitable and equitable. If that makes some people uncomfortable, so be it." They talked for another 20 minutes about the business implications of the day's events, the potential media reaction, and the strategic challenges ahead. Marcus offered to send additional legal and HR support from their Boston office, which Victoria accepted gratefully. After ending the call, Victoria sat in silence, sipping her wine and processing the magnitude of what she had set in motion. There would be no going back now. She had crossed a line that separated the world of quiet corporate maneuvering from the realm of public accountability and social change. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with heavy clouds that seemed to mirror the somber mood at Metropolitan General Hospital. Victoria arrived at 7 a.m., 2 hours before the scheduled board meeting, wanting to observe the hospital's operations during the morning shift change. The main lobby buzzed with activity as the day staff arrived and the night shift prepared to depart. Victoria positioned herself near the information desk, where she could observe the flow of patients, families, and visitors, without being immediately recognized. What she saw was revealing. The interactions between staff and patients varied dramatically depending on the perceived status of the individuals involved. Well-dressed white patients and families received warm greetings, helpful directions, and solicitous attention. Patients of color, those who appeared to be of modest economic means, or those who seemed confused or uncertain were treated with barely concealed impatience. It wasn't universal. Some staff members were genuinely courteous to everyone, but the pattern was unmistakable. The discrimination she had experienced was not an aberration but rather a symptom of a much deeper institutional problem. At 8:30, Victoria made her way to the executive conference room where the board of directors was gathering. She had met some of these individuals during the acquisition process, but others were seeing her for the first time. Their reactions ranged from professional courtesy to barely disguised surprise at her youth and race. The meeting began promptly at 9 with Victoria's formal introduction as the new chairman and CEO. She outlined her vision for the hospital's future, emphasizing the 4 core principles she had established the night before: respect, excellence, equity, and accountability. Board member Robert Blackwood, a prominent local attorney, raised concerns about the financial implications of her proposed changes. "Miss Hamilton, while I applaud your commitment to equality, we need to be realistic about market forces. Our VIP program generates nearly 30% of our profit margin. If we start treating all patients equally, we risk losing our most profitable customers. Victoria's response was measured but firm. Mr. Blackwood, I understand your concern about profitability. However, I would argue that discriminatory practices represent a far greater financial risk than equitable treatment. A single successful discrimination lawsuit could cost us more than our VIP program generates in 5 years. She pulled up a presentation on her laptop. Furthermore, research shows that hospitals with strong reputations for inclusive care actually attract more patients across all demographic groups. Families of all backgrounds want to know that their loved ones will be treated with respect and dignity. The presentation continued for another hour, covering staffing changes, policy revisions, training programs, and performance metrics. By the end, Victoria had secured the board's support for her transformation initiative, though she could tell that some members remained skeptical. As the meeting concluded, board member Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to the outgoing CEO, approached Victoria privately. "I want you to know that I support what you're doing," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "I've seen the discrimination firsthand, and I've tried to address it through normal channels without success. Sometimes it takes dramatic action to create real change." Victoria nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Dr. Morrison. I'll need allies on the board as we move forward." "This won't be easy." "The right thing rarely is," Dr. Morrison replied. Over the following weeks, Victoria threw herself into the work of transformation with the single-minded focus that had made her successful in the financial world. She conducted dozens of staff meetings, reviewed hundreds of patient complaint files, and interviewed potential candidates for key leadership positions. The initial resistance was significant. Several department heads resigned rather than adapt to the new standards, and a number of long-term employees requested transfers to other facilities within the healthcare system. There were anonymous complaints filed with regulatory agencies, threatening letters from disgruntled former employees, and critical coverage in some local media outlets. But there were also signs of progress. Patient satisfaction scores began to improve within the first month. Complaints about discriminatory treatment dropped dramatically. New staff members hired under the revised standards brought fresh energy and commitment to inclusive care. Most importantly, the culture began to shift. Employees who had previously felt powerless to address discriminatory behavior by colleagues found their voices and their courage. Training programs focusing on cultural competency and unconscious bias became standard requirements rather than optional professional development. Victoria instituted weekly walking rounds where she would spend time in different areas of the hospital, observing interactions and talking with staff, patients, and families. These rounds became legendary among the staff, who knew that their new CEO was always watching, and that excellence would be recognized, while discrimination would be swiftly addressed. 3 months after the acquisition, Victoria received a letter that made all the challenges worthwhile. It was from Maria Rodriguez, the daughter of an elderly patient who had been treated in the hospital's emergency department. "Dear Miss Hamilton," the letter began, "I wanted to thank you for the changes you've made at Metropolitan General. My father, who speaks limited English and has no insurance, was treated with such kindness and respect during his recent visit. The nurses took extra time to explain his condition in Spanish. The doctors never made him feel like a burden, and the social worker helped us navigate the financial assistance programs." The letter continued, "A year ago, when my father had a different medical emergency, we went to Metropolitan General and had a very different experience. The staff were impatient, dismissive, and made us feel like we were wasting their time. I swore we would never go back. But when my neighbor told me about the changes under your leadership, we decided to give it another chance. The difference was like night and day." Victoria kept that letter on her desk as a reminder of why the difficult work of transformation was necessary. It represented not just one family's positive experience, but the countless other families who would benefit from a culture of respect and inclusivity. The success at Metropolitan General began to attract national attention. Healthcare administration journals published articles about the hospital's transformation model. Victoria was invited to speak at medical conferences about inclusive healthcare practices. Other hospital systems reached out to learn from their experience. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 6 months after her aunt's stroke, Eleanor Hamilton had recovered sufficiently to attend the hospital's annual gala, an event that Victoria had transformed from an exclusive social gathering into a community celebration of healthcare heroes. As Victoria delivered the evening's keynote address about the power of compassionate care, she noticed Eleanor in the audience, tears of pride streaming down her face. After the speech, Eleanor approached the podium. "I always knew you would do something remarkable with your life," Eleanor said, embracing her niece. "But I never imagined you would change an entire institution single-handedly. I had help, Victoria replied, gesturing toward the diverse group of staff members, patients, and community leaders gathered in the ballroom. Real change requires everyone's commitment, not just one person's vision. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Victoria found herself back in the main lobby where her journey had begun. The VIP elevator bank still existed, but the security checkpoint had been replaced with a simple information desk staffed by volunteers from the community. The marble floors still gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the designer furniture still spoke of quality and care. But the atmosphere had changed fundamentally. This was no longer a place where dignity was rationed based on perceived worth. It was a healing space where everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or ability to pay, could expect to be treated with respect. Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Saw the coverage of tonight's gala. You've built something incredible there. Ready to take on the next challenge? She smiled as she typed back. Always. Walking toward the exit, Victoria passed a young black woman who was clearly visiting a patient, carrying flowers and a get-well card. The woman approached the information desk with a slight hesitation, as if unsure whether she belonged in such an elegant space. The volunteer at the desk, an elderly white man who had been part of the community outreach program Victoria had established, greeted her with a warm smile. Good evening. How can I help you tonight? I'm here to visit my grandmother, the young woman said. She's in room 412. Of course, the volunteer replied, consulting his computer. The elevators to the 4th floor are right over there. Visiting hours continue until 9 p.m., so you have plenty of time. I hope your grandmother is feeling better soon. Thank you so much, the woman said, her relief evident. As Victoria watched this simple, courteous interaction, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what transformation looked like, not grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but the accumulation of countless small moments where human dignity was respected and protected. Outside in the cool evening air, Victoria paused to look back at the hospital's illuminated facade. The building looked the same as it had on that difficult afternoon months earlier, but everything that mattered had changed. The culture of discrimination that had once thrived within these walls had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something better. There would always be more work to do. Prejudice and discrimination were not problems that could be solved once and forgotten. They required constant vigilance, ongoing education, and the courage to address new challenges as they arose. But the foundation had been laid for an institution that truly embodied the healing mission of healthcare. Victoria's transformation of Metropolitan General Hospital became a case study in how individual actions, backed by systemic change and institutional accountability, could address even deeply entrenched discrimination. The woman who had been denied access to an elevator had not simply sought revenge, she had built a legacy of inclusion that would benefit thousands of patients and families for generations to come. As she settled into her car for the drive back to her hotel, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The 8-year-old girl who had been turned away from a swimming pool had grown up to ensure that no one would be turned away from the healing they needed. The young professional who had faced skepticism and prejudice in boardrooms across the country had learned to wield power not for personal gain, but for the greater good. The road ahead would bring new challenges, new opportunities to fight injustice and build more equitable institutions. But tonight, Victoria allowed herself a moment of quiet pride in what had been accomplished. She had kept the promise that 8-year-old girl had made to herself all those years ago, that someday, she would have the power to make sure everyone was treated with the dignity they deserved. In the end, that was what transformation really meant, not just changing policies or procedures, but changing hearts and minds, one interaction at a time. It was the kind of change that rippled outward from individual moments of courage, creating waves that could reshape entire communities. Victoria Hamilton had learned that lesson in a hospital lobby on a difficult afternoon when she was denied the simple courtesy of visiting her dying aunt. But she had taught that lesson to an entire institution, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the courage to demand nothing more than basic human respect. The city lights blurred past her window as the car pulled away from Metropolitan General Hospital. But Victoria's thoughts were already turning toward tomorrow's challenges and opportunities. There was always more work to be done in the fight for justice and equality, but tonight had proven that such work could indeed change the world, one person and one institution at a time.